The snow had been falling since morning, and the bakery on Elgin Street smelled like brown butter and cardamom. The kind of smell that makes you forget, just for a moment, that anything in your life has gone wrong. Trent Halsey stood near the back of the line with $7 in his wallet and a very specific problem. His daughter had asked for one thing this year. Not a toy, not new boots, not the tablet she'd been eyeing at Costco for 3 months. Just a birthday cake. A real one, from a real bakery, not the grocery store kind with the stiff white icing she'd politely eaten and said nothing about for the past 2 years. She was turning 8, and she had asked with the kind of quiet dignity that only children can manage. The kind that makes your chest ache, because you know they already understand, more than they should. He had $7. The smallest cake in the display case was 34. Trent did the math the way you do when you've been doing that math for 2 years. Automatically, without drama, like checking the weather. He'd been a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Ottawa until 18 months ago, when the housing correction hit and they cut the entire residential division in a single Tuesday afternoon meeting. Since then he'd been freelancing, picking up code reviews and site assessments, enough to keep the apartment and keep Maeve in her school, but not enough for much else. Not enough for cakes that cost $34. He was about to step out of line when he noticed the woman in front of him. She was somewhere in her early 40s, he guessed, wearing a gray wool coat that looked expensive in a quiet way. No logo, no flash, just the kind of quality that announces itself by how it drapes. She was holding a small box from the display case, a single-serve lemon tart with a birthday candle already tucked into the corner of the packaging, and she was standing very still with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to something that was making her jaw tighten. He wasn't trying to overhear. The bakery was small, and the line was slow, and the woman in front of her was having difficulty with the debit machine. "I understand," she said into the phone, very quietly. "I understand. No, you don't need to explain it again." She lowered the phone, stared at the lemon tart in her hand for a moment. Then she stepped up to the counter, set it down, and slid her card across. The machine beeped. She glanced at the screen, slid the card again. "I'm sorry," the young man behind the counter said with genuine apology. "It's declining. Try it again, please." It declined again. Trent watched her face do something complicated. Not embarrassment, exactly. More like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been managing things alone for a very long time and has just run out of capacity for one more small problem. She reached into her bag for a second card. He could see her hands moving quickly, with the controlled efficiency of someone who does not allow themselves to visibly fall apart in public. He looked at the tart. He looked at the single candle. He looked at his $7. "Excuse me," he said. "I've got it." She turned. She had dark eyes and the kind of direct gaze that made him feel briefly that she was assessing a situation rather than just looking at a person. "I'm sorry?" "The tart. I'll cover it." He was already handing the bills across the counter. "It's fine, please." She looked at the money, then at him, then at the candle. "It's her birthday?" he asked, because he didn't know why else. Someone bought a single-serve tart with a birthday candle at 4 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in November. Something shifted in her expression. "My daughter's, yes. She's with her father tonight. She stopped. "I was just going to drop it off." "Happy birthday to her then," he said. The young man handed her the tart in a small white bag. She held it carefully with both hands. "Thank you," she said. I don't know why you did that." "I have a daughter," Trent said. "Birthday cakes matter." She looked at him for another second, and then she walked out, and the cold air came in briefly when the door opened, and Trent went to the counter and bought the last 2 remaining butter tarts, $1.25 each, because that was what he could afford, and he stood outside for a moment wondering what he was going to tell Maeve. He would figure something out. He always did. Her name was Brigitte Savin. And she was, professionally speaking, having the worst month of her career, which was saying something because her career had included a hostile board removal at 36, a funding collapse that made the business section of the Globe and Mail, and a pandemic year during which she had personally managed the wind down of a company she had spent 8 years building. She was now 42 and the managing partner of a capital advisory firm with offices in Ottawa and Toronto, and she had spent the last 3 weeks deciding whether to recommend her firm's backing for a major mixed-use development project in the Glebe. It was a significant file, the kind of file that, if it went wrong, went publicly wrong, in ways that followed you. She was also, as of that phone call in the bakery line, no longer in a relationship with a man she had been seeing for 14 months, who had chosen, this particular Wednesday, to explain that he found her professionally consuming and emotionally unavailable, two criticisms that she had heard before and that she suspected were accurate. She sat in her car for a while after leaving the bakery. The white bag sat on the passenger seat. She had been planning to stop by Martin's apartment and leave the Tart with the doorman, because Chloe was spending her 8th birthday there, and Brigitte had a 7 o'clock call with a due diligence team in Vancouver, and there had not been time to rearrange any of it. There had not been time. That was the sentence she had been building her life around for the past several years. She thought about the man in line, the $7, the way he'd handed the money over before she could say anything, without making a performance of it, without the kind of exaggerated casualness that makes a generous act feel like a transaction. I have a daughter. Birthday cakes matter. She drove to Martin's apartment. She carried the Tart upstairs herself instead of leaving it with the doorman. She sat with Chloe for 20 minutes, watching her daughter blow out the candle and eat the entire tart with a fork, and the specific focused happiness that 8-year-olds bring to small pleasures. And then Brigitte kissed her goodbye and drove back across the bridge and took her Vancouver call and did not think about the man in the bakery again, or she tried not to. Trent had been working on a development proposal for 7 months. It had started as a favor. His old colleague Pam had introduced him to a small consortium of landowners in Vanier who were trying to put together a mixed-use community project, affordable housing above, local service retail below, a courtyard with a splash pad and some raised beds, the kind of project that made theoretical sense in every planning document the city produced and somehow almost never got built. They needed an engineer who understood the structural side and could help them put together something credible enough to attract capital backing. Trent had said yes because Pam had asked, and because the work was interesting, and because the project was genuinely good, the kind of thing that could make a real difference in a neighborhood that had been talked about in city council reports for a decade without anything actually changing. He had also said yes because if the project secured backing and moved to the development phase, there was a contract attached that would pay him enough to cover 2 years of stable income. He had not told Pam that part. He had not told anyone. He had given the proposal everything he had. He'd worked on it at the kitchen table after Maeve went to sleep, in the early mornings before she woke up, on weekends, when she was at her grandmother's in Kingston. He had run the numbers 6 different ways, sourced every material cost, mapped the structural requirements to the soil conditions, and built a contingency model that accounted for 3 different zoning scenarios. He was, professionally, proud of it. The consortium had submitted it to 3 capital advisory firms for consideration. One of them was Savin LaChance Partners. The review meeting was held in the 2nd week of December, in a boardroom on the 9th floor of a building on Spark Street that looked out over the river. Trent had taken the bus. He was wearing the jacket he wore to every professional meeting. Charcoal gray, good cut, the one thing he'd kept from his previous life that still looked like it belonged in a room like this. He had not expected to see the woman from the bakery. She walked in with 2 colleagues and sat at the head of the table, and he recognized her immediately. The gray coat was gone, but the directness was the same. That quality of assessing before engaging, and he felt something drop in his stomach. That had nothing to do with the proposal. She did not appear to recognize him. He went through the presentation. He knew the material better than he'd known anything in years. He answered every question cleanly. He could see one of her colleagues, a younger man named Bryson who seemed to be performing skepticism for reasons Trent couldn't quite identify, was looking for angles to push back on, and Trent had an answer for every one of them. Load tolerances, foundation depth, phasing schedule, soil remediation costs, the specific section of the zoning bylaw that addressed their courtyard proposal. Brigitte asked 2 questions the whole meeting. The first was about the contingency model. He walked her through it. She nodded once. The second was near the end. What's your biggest risk from your perspective? He thought about that for a moment. He could have given her the standard answer: market conditions, materials pricing, municipal approval timelines. He gave her the real one instead: Community trust, he said. Vanier has seen a lot of proposals. A lot of consultations that didn't turn into anything. If this project doesn't move on the timeline we've laid out, we'll lose the residents before we ever break ground. That's the thing I'd be watching. She looked at him, not the way you look at someone giving a presentation, the way you look at someone who has just said something you weren't expecting. Thank you, she said. We'll be in touch with the consortium. He took the bus home. He picked up Maeve from the after-school program. He made pasta and tried to be present for the conversation about which kids in her class were friends now versus before, and the complicated social geography of second grade. He waited. The consortium received the decision 3 weeks later, not recommended for backing. No explanation beyond standard language about risk profile and portfolio fit. Trent read the letter twice. He sat at the kitchen table, with his coffee going cold, and he went through the proposal again, looking for what he'd missed, what he could have done differently, and he couldn't find it. The numbers were solid. The community engagement was documented. The risk model was thorough. He called Pam. She didn't have any more information than he did. These things happen, she said, and he could hear that she meant it kindly, and he thanked her and got off the phone and sat for a while longer. Maeve found him there when she got up for a glass of water at 9:30. She was in the oversized sleep shirt she'd inherited from her grandmother, the one with the faded loon on it, and she looked at him with the serious expression she sometimes wore that made her seem much older than 8. Did something bad happen, she asked. No, he said. Just some work stuff. She climbed up onto the chair beside him. You don't have to pretend. He looked at her. It's nothing you need to worry about. I know, she said, but you can still tell me. He did not tell her, but he sat with her for 20 minutes while she drank her water and told him about a book she was reading, about a girl who builds a raft, and by the time she went back to bed, some of the tightness in his chest had eased. Not gone. Just eased. He called Pam again the next morning and asked if she could find out. Through back channels, whether there was any substantive reason for the rejection that hadn't made it into the letter. Brigitte had not been the one to make the final recommendation. That was the thing she came back to later when she was trying to understand how it had happened. The Vanier file had gone to committee, herself, Bryson, and their senior analyst, Odette, and Bryson had run the formal evaluation. His report had flagged 3 issues: the consortium's lack of prior development experience, the compressed approval timeline, and what he'd characterized as over-reliance on a single engineering lead whose independent track record was, in his words, limited. She had read the report on a Tuesday morning between 2 other meetings. She had approved the recommendation without requesting a secondary review. She had trusted Bryson's process because Bryson had been thorough on every file for 3 years, and she had not had time to go back through the primary documentation herself. This was, she would later realize, the decision that mattered. She didn't realize it yet in December. She was managing 8 other files, the end of a year that had taken more out of her than most, and a custody schedule that required more coordination than most corporate restructurings she'd advised on. She was not thinking about Trent Halsey or the Vanier proposal. She was thinking about Chloe, who had asked last week why Brigitte was never home for dinner anymore. She was thinking about the fact that she had said soon in response, the way she always said soon, and that Chloe had nodded and gone back to her drawing with the patient resignation of a child who has learned not to push. She was thinking about a man in a bakery line handing over $7 without hesitation or fanfare. She was not, she told herself, thinking about that. January in Ottawa is a specific kind of cold, not the dramatic cold of the prairie, not the damp cold of the coast, just a sustained, matter-of-fact coldness that settles into the city and stays, week after week, until you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic. Trent had picked up 2 new freelance assessments in the new year, enough to cover February. He had submitted the Vanier proposal to 2 other capital sources on behalf of the consortium, though he knew the rejection from a firm like Seven Lachance would give other reviewers pause. He was coming out of a client meeting near Bank Street when he ran into Pam having lunch at an outdoor heater setup that only Ottawans would consider acceptable in January, and she waved him over with the urgency of someone who has information they cannot wait to deliver. I heard something, she said, about the Vanier file. He sat down. I don't know how accurate this is, Pam said. but someone I trust told me that the person who ran the evaluation at 7 La Chance, the one who wrote the actual report, he's been quietly managing a conflict of interest for about 6 months. There's another project in that area he has a personal financial stake in. Through a numbered company. Trent was quiet. If that's true, Pam said, the rejection wasn't about your proposal. He drove home slowly. He did not know what to do with this. He did not know if it was true, or how verifiable it was, or whether doing anything with it would help the consortium, or just make him look like someone who couldn't accept a rejection. He sat with it for 2 days. On the third day, he wrote a letter. He addressed it to Brigitte Sevin directly, not to the firm, not to a general inquiry address. Her professional contact was publicly listed. He wrote carefully, without accusation, laying out what he had heard and what he was asking, that the firm review whether proper conflict of interest protocols had been followed in the evaluation of the Vanier file. He attached the full proposal, the financial model, and a 1-page summary of the community engagement that had gone into it. He did not expect a response. Brigitte read the letter on a Thursday morning, and then she read it again. She pulled the Vanier file. She read Bryson's evaluation report, this time carefully, the way she should have read it in December. She called Odette into her office and asked her to pull every file Bryson had touched in the past 8 months that involved properties within 3 kilometers of the Vanier site. Odette came back 2 hours later with a look that Brigitte recognized. The specific expression of someone who has found something they did not want to find. It took Brigitte 4 days to confirm what the letter had suggested. Bryson had a financial interest through a numbered Ontario company registered to his mother's address in a competing development on an adjacent parcel. The conflict had not been declared. The Vanier evaluation had been assigned to him after that interest was established. She had not known. She had approved a recommendation she had not read closely enough, generated by a process she had not scrutinized closely enough, and a legitimate project. One that, looking at it now with full attention, was genuinely well constructed, had been turned down for reasons that had nothing to do with its merit. She called her lawyer. She called her compliance officer. She called her business partner in Toronto. And then she found Trent Halsey's number in his letter and she called him. He answered on the third ring and she said, "This is Brigitte Sevin. I'm calling about the Vanier proposal." A pause. "Okay. I've completed a review," she said. "I want to be direct with you. There was a conflict of interest in our evaluation process that was not disclosed and should have been. The recommendation against your proposal was made in compromised circumstances. I'm sorry. That's not the way we operate, and it's not what should have happened to your project." Another pause. Longer. "The proposal itself," she continued, "is one of the better community development submissions I've reviewed in several years. I'd like to meet with you and the consortium if you're open to it. My firm would like to reconsider." She heard him exhale. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, yes. We can do that." They met the following Tuesday without Bryson, who was no longer with the firm, and with Odette, and a community development specialist named Fran who had joined from the city planning office and knew the Vanier neighborhood from years of working in it. Trent brought the consortium leads. A woman named Pierrette, who had been organizing in that community for 11 years, and a retired contractor named Hugh, who had grown up 3 streets from the proposed site. Brigitte watched how Trent moved in the room. Not as someone who'd been vindicated and wanted recognition for it, but as someone who was already focused on the next problem. The next question, what needed to happen to actually get this built? She found it. Clarifying was the word that came to her, the way competence without ego can be clarifying. The meeting ran 2 hours over. Walking back to her office after, Odette said, "That's a good project." "I know," Brigitte said. "You knew before. I didn't look closely enough before." Odette was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to tell him that?" She already had. The funding commitment came through in March. Trent got the call on a Friday afternoon, standing in the parking lot of Maeve's school waiting for dismissal. He had to ask the person on the other end to repeat the number, because he had been holding himself at a specific careful distance from hoping for this for so long that the confirmation didn't land cleanly at first. He stood in the parking lot and felt the cold through his jacket and watched the school doors. And when they opened and Maeve came out in her orange snow pants and her backpack that was slightly too big for her, scanning the crowd for him with that focused little frown she got, he waved, and she saw him, and she ran. He caught her and swung her up the way he'd been doing since she was 3. Even though she was probably getting too old for it and would tell him so soon, and she laughed and grabbed his shoulders and said, "What happened? You have a weird face." "Good news," he said. "What kind?" "The work kind. The kind that means we get to stay." She looked at him. She knew enough of their circumstances to understand what that meant. She had always known more than he'd wanted her to. "Okay," she said with 8-year-old seriousness. "Good." The site preparation meeting in April was held on location, in the parking lot of the former auto body shop that would eventually become the project's eastern anchor. It was a Saturday morning, muddy with spring melt, and Brigitte was there because she had made it a policy to walk every site she backed, a habit from her early career that she'd let slip in the years she spent behind boardroom glass. She saw Trent before he saw her. He was in work boots and a worn field jacket, crouched down to look at something with the city engineer, their breath making small clouds in the April air. Hugh was next to him, and Pierrette was on her phone nearby, and the whole thing looked like what it was, a project that was actually happening. He stood up and turned and saw her. "You're here," he said. "I walked the sites," she said. "I should have been doing it more." He looked at the lot, the broken asphalt, the chain-link fence, the muddy margins where the snow had finally receded. "It doesn't look like much right now." "They never do," she said. "That's the part I like." He handed her a hard hat from the stack in the back of Hugh's truck, and she put it on without comment, and they walked the site. The footprint of the future building, the courtyard that would eventually have the splash pad and the raised beds, the laneway that would connect to the street. Trent told her things she hadn't known to ask about, load-bearing walls and thermal performance, and how they were planning the foundation to handle the freeze-thaw cycle, and she asked questions and he answered them. At some point they stopped walking and were just standing at the edge of what would eventually be the courtyard, looking at the mud. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure, in the bakery. In November. You spent what you had, you didn't know me." He was quiet for a moment. "It was a birthday candle." "I know, I wasn't doing you a favor," he said. It was a birthday." He paused. "I know what it costs to manage things on your own. I wasn't assuming anything about your situation. I just didn't want it to be a bad day for your daughter." Brigitte looked at the lot. "It wasn't," she said. She ate the whole thing in about 4 minutes and declared it the best birthday she'd ever had. She paused. "She's 8. They're very efficient at that age," he said. She laughed. It came out more genuinely than she'd expected. The project broke ground in June, and there was a small ceremony with the ward counselor and some residents and a photographer from the local paper, and Pierrette cried, which made Hugh cry, which made Trent feel like crying, which he managed not to. Brigitte came. She stood at the edge of the crowd because she was not the story here, and she knew it. Afterwards, most people drifted away, and Trent found her near the fence. "My daughter keeps asking about yours," he said. She looked at him. "How does she know about mine?" "I may have mentioned the birthday tart situation. You told your 8-year-old that story. She asks about my day. I tell her things." He paused. "She thinks it's very important that we report back on whether your daughter's next birthday also goes well." Brigitte said nothing for a moment. "That's a very specific accountability standard. She's detail-oriented. So is Chloe." She looked at the site. The turned earth, the yellow tape, the beginning of something. "There's a place in the market she likes. Crepes. If your daughter would consider crepes an appropriate birthday-adjacent celebration food." "I'll check her constitution," he said. "But I suspect yes." They walked out through the gate together, and the Ottawa summer was doing its brief and particular best, the sky that particular blue, the air actually warm for once, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things don't need to be named right away. Some things you can just let begin.